I was reading a book by Hofstadter recently. I wonder if it might interest you because he's very focused on like music and beauty. In particular, trying to understand. I think his reason for wanting to look into that is he thinks that those are like the more complex patterns that can exist in a mind, and so he's interested
Nice.
in patterns and focuses on those.
Yeah. What's it called?
He has different things. The one I was looking at was blah, blah, blah. Meta. Here it is. Metamagical themas.
Themas. Okay, cool. That looks like a very thick book.
Yeah, it's like a collection of articles. So I've
Mm,
only dug a couple pages into it, but he apparently wrote an article, like a monthly column of around 10, 20 pages for Scientific American for like a
hmm
year and a half. And they kind of said, hey, we have this existing column, this very famous column from a guy who does mathematical games and kind of just, explores that. And what was the guy's name? But and so this is actually an anagram of that. So he took mathematical games, rearranged the letters, and made metamagical themas. Uh,
Interesting.
because they
Okay.
said, that guy is you're going to basically replace that guy or take over his space in the column for now. And I think his name is Martin Gardner. And so among people who, he was very famous at the time, apparently, for making these explorations that were kind of fun for the layman about mathematics and things. And so Douglas Hofstadter, liked that, and then was very excited to get this column thing, and so yeah, it's just a bunch of his entire stint at that magazine put into a book form. So it's more chunked up than might be obvious, but yeah, I didn't realize he had like I know that he's very interested in the mind, but he kind of says like, oh, like I have a wide range of interests and I really am into music, and this is kind of why, and the two interests dovetail, even though maybe people look at my columns and they're like, how does all this stuff fit together? He's like, it fits together in my head, but yeah.
Yeah, cool. I do think that art is quite complex and some of the most complex things that we have in the universe. But I don't know if there's a easy way to compare that to just like, life. But certainly up there.
He says, to me, the deepest and most mysterious of all patterns is music, a product of the mind has not come close to fathoming yet. In some sense, all my research is aimed at finding patterns that will help us understand the mysteries of musical and visual beauty. And he says, I could be bolder and say, I seek to discover what musical and visual beauty really are. He goes on from there. So
Wow. I'm interested.
nice. I saw that sentence. I don't know if the book will actually, deliver on that for your interest, but I thought that sentence probably needs to get into your head at some point.
Yeah, definitely. That's cool.
But nice. What you been up to?
That's about it. Well, wait, I didn't say anything. Sorry. I've been writing a lot, which is what I mostly do. Um, Editing a bunch of making videos, editing stuff. You saw I edited one of these talks. So that's about it.
Cool.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Nice. Well, I had a
Mostly,
couple.
sorry, I'm just saying one of the things I've been writing is about mediums, art mediums, and I'm trying to establish that all of the things that can be conveyed in art is substrate independent, which means that it could be conveyed in any medium. Anything can be conveyed in any medium. And then kind of building up this sense of accuracy, or sorry, not accuracy, efficiency with some mediums and inefficiency. Like some ideas can be conveyed efficiently in some certain mediums and then less efficiently in other mediums. But presumably, because of substrate independence and universality, any idea can be conveyed in any medium.
I'd push back on that and say that when it comes to the relationship between like physical things and abstract things, that's sort of the boundary where you have the substrate independence. So you can just say, hey, if I want to communicate the state of on versus the state of off. All I need is two. I need one bit of information, and I can choose to store that bit in a wide variety of physical media, a coin that's flipped heads or tails, or what have you, or anything like that, or a cookie that is on the table or not on the table, where there's a circle around it. And so there's lots of ways you can convey that on-off information. However, so that's where the substrate independence exists. But meanwhile, when it comes to like saying, I'm going to go up a level and think not only about information. Well, now there are certain things that you can maybe convey in one information architecture that you couldn't in another. So, like if you can have like a very general type of information architecture, like a graph or something, then a graph which has like nodes and connections between them, you can connect them on all kinds of different ways, including in a line, if you want to communicate a line of words, for instance, or a more complicated friend network. However, if you said, I can only represent the information architecture or data structure known as a sequence, then you couldn't you couldn't show anything more complicated than that. So like if you say, I can only say this comes after this, but I can't say that I have friends A, B, and C, and they have friends D, E, and F. That will just be inexpressible, at least efficiently, within that system. You'd have to find a way of like saying sentences, which amounted to, you could probably technically represent a complicated graph in sentences. I can just list off all the relationships, but it won't be as efficient maybe. So maybe you're right there. It would depend on a few things, but yeah, anyway. So substrate independence is, I think, mostly about the relationship between abstract information and physical systems. When it comes to the expressiveness of any particular information system, ignoring any of the physical details, the analysis gets a bit different.
Interesting. Yeah, I can see that with graphs, certain graphs being restricted in such a way that they can't convey certain information, but they just wouldn't be universal. But I think more generally, you'll perhaps be able to say that you could convey any information that could be conveyed auditorily. You can convey that information visually. Now, whether you can convey it in a particular graph or like in a sequence of numbers, that's a different type of thing, but you could convey it visually, I think.
Yeah. So I guess there's this question of expressiveness of a particular medium. Is it universal or not? And there's a question there. And then, then you have a separate question of physical systems embodying information things. Yeah. So I guess that's one area where what becomes interesting maybe is that even with a system which is universal, you have many systems, all of which can embody the same information, but then they're not all equally good at it. And so that's kind of another issue there. And then the question becomes maybe like, do you care about that efficiency or not? Because ultimately you might say, if you're a computer programmer, you might say, I actually don't care what computer is being used to run my program because they can all run it. So I don't have to care. So that's a situation where you don't care. Then again, you might say, I know that actually if you want to run this game and have a good experience, it's going to need to be this fast. So there you do care about the efficiency. So maybe if you're a philosopher, you don't care so much about the the detailed runtime.
Right.
But if you're a game developer, you do.
Yes, and if you're trying to experience a work of art, I think the efficiency does matter quite a bit at that point. Yeah.
Yeah, and even there, it's also interesting to think about the different types of performance, because runtime is one sort of thing, but you can take the same computer or the same program and just run it more slowly, but all of the core functionality is exactly the same. So there's one kind of performance which is just about changing the speed at which every step occurs. There's a different type of efficiency which is actually changing which steps are taken. And so there's obviously a difference between searching through the entire dictionary word by word to find what you're looking for and just doing it really fast versus like, I have a way of looking at, actually it's alphabetized and indexed, and I can navigate in like 5 steps to the exact word I want, regardless of how big the dictionary is, more or less. That's just a different way of navigating it. And maybe, but they're both the same total duration. But obviously, there's different steps you're taking along the way. So it isn't just about the speed of each individual step, but which steps you take that will
Hmm.
determine the efficiency. Yeah, so I think that distinction comes up in various places.
Hmm. Yeah. We got to think about that. Different forms of efficiency.
Yeah, I guess you could just say like, how expensive is every step? How long does it take? How much resources does it require? And then also, how many steps do you take?
Mhm.
Uh, yeah, that's and then you just multiply those. Um, so you can be efficient. You can have a low resource usage by removing steps or by making every step cheaper. Um, Incidentally, one of the things I remember seeing, I'm always interested in, how does the human mind work? And I remember looking at an interview on Lex Friedman with a guy who said it had something to do with um, complicated programs that analyze constraints. And I thought, oh, constraints, that's a word that I often think about. So let me see what this guy has to say. And I thought maybe it'll be very relevant to how the mind works. Um, and he said, actually, it turned out that he was discussing was what they call like constraint solvers, which is like these complicated mathematical problems where you set up like a million little equations. And then you try to find some solution to these for some, and this is useful for whatever reason. But as he was saying that, I thought, oh, okay, this is a very different picture than the one that I would have of the mind. He wasn't necessarily talking about the mind to begin with, but I thought, is there a connection between this sort of mathematical problem that he's talking about and has worked on, and the sort of things I'm interested in? And I think, I didn't give it a super deep analysis, but what I left with was, he's talking about this really complicated set of like millions of equations and how to solve that. I thought, I feel like the thing that matters for the mind is more like, you just have these dumb, slow, bumbling thoughts that somehow in like 10 steps will find something that some other system which can do a trillion computations a second can't do. So just I let that thinking like, okay, the human thinking is very slow and simple in some sense. Like there's elements of complicated parallel processing and craziness at low levels, but at sort of the high conscious level, our thinking is very slow and simple. And I'm just like, I thought of, you said the sentence that made me think of medieval times and whatever, and therefore this other idea came up to my mind, and I think that might help or be interesting. So in our heads, it's only like two or three little things have happened, even if a million things happened at a deeper level. So I just remember thinking, okay, like any system which tries to understand the mind and has like a million equations in it, I sort of throw my hands up and think, I don't think that's what I'm looking for in terms of understanding the mind. I think we're doing things
Right.
that are usually simpler.
We're, this is back to the efficiency, right? Like we're efficient in some way, but we're not step by step efficient, right? So we're not doing a trillion computations in a second, but our five computations are somehow efficient enough to be better than the trillion computations per second. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, like I guess it could be that at some low level, there's going to be a trillion things happening with the neurons, but there will be also be this higher level, oftentimes where we can describe it as like, oh, only three steps or whatever. And so thinking about, oh, well, in what world, like, what does it take to have a system which thinks at least thinks of itself as taking only three steps to get to a solution, and we think it's pretty commonsensical and whatever, but somehow we do it, and in a way where it's like this isn't quite the same thing, maybe, but it reminds me of how we don't really fully appreciate like how sophisticated our minds are until you just like see an animal or something, totally like not get what the world is about. Like, we can look at the entrance to a building and be like, okay, so you walk up to it, you turn the handle, you go in, it's fine. All these things are very transparent to us, but to many animals, they wouldn't be. And so you just think, man, there's something about the way our minds are set up and what we've learned that makes all these things seem very, very easy. There's a thing, there's an object, you can turn it, walk in, whatever. But it's not intrinsically easy. There's a world out there where you set up a robot and you put it outside the building and it starts just number crunching for half an hour, and then it says, okay, move forward 1 foot, and then eventually it starts, it takes 10 hours of trying different things at the door to figure out how to, what to do to get in. And nowadays, if you train a neural network and everything, like the robotics and everything, you have the humans training the system. So we wouldn't see an actual robot have this trouble. But if you didn't give it any like human supervision and you just had some more naive search algorithm put in front of the building trying to get in, it would be really comically stupid. Yeah, it would be just searching through these very, very low level possible plans and possible ways of moving its various limbs, not realizing like, oh, this is just a very simple situation, dude. It's just a building with the door in front with a handle. I can communicate
It,
to you in one sentence what it is.
is it so different from a baby though? Like children, obviously, they kind of flail their arms around when they're learning how to move at first, and they come to doors, and I guess they wouldn't even have an opportunity to open a door, as a kid. So there's lots of attempts to move around. There's lots of attempts to open doors, but they're not able to until they're like, 5 or whatever. I don't know. So does it seem similar to you, or does it feel still different?
Yeah, I think in all these cases, you can distinguish between sort of the foundational intelligence elements and then the specific knowledge that you have. And so in this case, when I point out that it's very easy for us to get into a building and we can describe that situation in one sentence. I'm in front of the building. There's a door. There's an entrance. There's a handle on there. If the handle is open, I'll turn it and I can open the door, push on it, walk in. So that description is possible if you have the right knowledge. And our minds are such that we can acquire that. And so part of what I'm pointing out, I guess, is just that, yeah, like, wow, there is a world in which the situation can be described very simply.
Right.
Babies don't have that yet, but they can get it.
Mhm.
Yeah. So, it kind of, one way of putting that is that there are patterns in reality, such as the existence of doors and door handles and the idea of turning things, rotating them in space, and that you can do that with the door handle. So I guess in one way, what I'm ultimately saying is that when you approach this building, one level of description is very complex, and there are many, many atoms involved. And so if your worldview, if your explanatory framework only consisted of atoms, then it's fine. It's a true description of reality at that level, but you are missing out on these hugely simplifying patterns that are there. And so like the fact that like many of the atoms you're looking at as you look out are part of a fixed building that will not move. And if you try to push on it, you wouldn't get anywhere. If you didn't realize that, then you might try pushing on all those things, all those trillions of atoms. But yeah, again, if you know that they're all part of this quote unquote solid architecture, you can already, one way of describing that is that you can now eliminate all of those atoms as things that you need to interact with because they are quote unquote solid, and that you can't move them. Of course, if you had a bigger machine, you could push on them, you can move them. Ultimately, at this low level, they're just atoms and their connections to each other and whatever. But there is this much, much higher level, much, much simpler level. And if you can get to that level, things become, billions, trillions of times easier. In a world where there was no such level, where there were just this crazy complexity of atoms, then there wouldn't be anything, there wouldn't be any patterns to exploit. It would just be a pure chaotic realm, in which case, it doesn't help to be intelligent because there's nothing to discover.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I was recently thinking about solipsism a little bit, and I came to a kind of a strange definition that solipsism was that no patterns could repeat. So, as you're saying, like our the intelligence is the fact that we can notice patterns, and then those patterns are in our mind, and they reflect the world. Whereas a typical solipsist would say that the patterns of the world cannot be reflected in our mind. And then if you take that to some very extreme degree, then there would be no patterns that could repeat at all. So not in your mind at different points in time, they won't be repeating, or obviously nothing outside can be known to the person. So there's no, anyway, there's something about nothing being able to repeat no knowledge being able to replicate or no patterns being able to be noticed, that type of thing.
I thought solipsism was more about the idea that everything that I'm seeing is just part of me. It's I'm the only thing that
Yes.
exists. But that doesn't necessarily require you to change any of the way you do your science. It just makes you say like, oh, like there is no external world. It's all the internal world, but I can do science on that.
Right. There is no exterior world, right? So there's, or rather, there we can have no knowledge of the exterior world. So there's a barrier between where knowledge can flow. Like there can be no knowledge outside that comes inside. Okay, but that's the typical definition. And then the question is, why have the barrier at this particular place, like your mind and outside world? And if you investigate that barrier, then you have to push it further and further to be like, only in one particular moment, I can only know something in this one particular moment, but it can't be the outside world and it can't be anything else. And I can't know future or past, and none of my theories can represent anything else at all. And that's the more extreme version of solipsism, which is that I'm summarizing as no patterns can repeat.
Hmm.
But yes, you're correct in the typical sense of solipsism is just that there's a barrier between the outside world, exterior world, and your mind, and nothing can flow between the two.
Yeah, interesting. I guess this relates a little bit to what Deutsch says in the beginning of Infinity about the idea of and he addresses solipsism directly, but he also talks about the idea that like if you think there's a realm that makes sense and then a realm that doesn't make sense outside of it, um, then and the two are connected somehow. That last bit matters because then the stuff that you can't understand, you're saying affects the things that you do understand. But
Mm-hmm.
if you allow that, then you're saying, well, whatever the contribution of the things I don't understand is going to be, I mean, I won't be able to understand any of that. So you could say, like, I understand this ball in my hand, but also God exists, and I can never understand Him, and He could also affect the ball. So if you want to make predictions about what the ball is going to do, you can say what you like, but then you also have to say, like, also God might do who knows what. So
Right.
I can't really guarantee what this ball is going to do.
Mm-hmm.
There's an unlimited asterisk on everything. Yeah, that's a somewhat different point.
Well, I actually think it is the same point, you know, the solipsism being that there's a barrier for your knowledge. Your knowledge cannot go outside of some barrier. And where you put the barrier is kind of arbitrary. So it can be, you know, outside of the solar system, we can't know anything, which is kind of a typical type of thing. Some people think that. Or at the smallest level, you know, if we go smaller than quarks, we can't know anything. Or if we go bigger than the galaxy, we can't know anything. Or if we are referencing God, we can't know anything out there. So there's always this like barrier. And then, as you said, if that external, if there's any permutation, like or permeation, what if the outside thing that you can't know affects the inside thing that you can know, then you're kind of all bets are off for everything.
Yeah, I tend to think in terms of there's this broader question, I suppose, of like what is the relationship of the mind with the rest of the world. And so I guess in the case of solipsism, there's a bit of a what do you call it? Skepticism about like the existence of an external world or of the fact that you can know anything about it. Um, and I'm actually looking at a little bit about this book from a guy named Andy Clark, and it's called Being There. And I think it's an older book written before the advent of LLMs. So I wonder, I need to check out his latest stuff. But his theory is um, that people who try to work on AI in the past were thinking in very logical terms and symbolic terms. And nowadays, with LLMs and all this stuff, people are very much thinking in terms of neural network terms, which is uh, one side of this debate of the symbols versus the neurons, the symbolic side versus the quote unquote connectionist side. You know, you buy a connection of lots of little things, in this case, neurons. And so he's kind of saying that like when people try to make intelligent systems that are just logic machines, they're making a mistake, and they should be thinking more in terms of how a system interacts with the world. Like you, when you're out in the world, you're operating on objects. You don't have to remember everything. You can just put an object on your desk, and you're interacting with the world now. And that is, in some sense, like a memory. Like you put a thing on a table, and it stays there, and you can exploit that fact. Uh, I think I probably disagree with his overall point, but he does at least raise this. You could think more, yeah, generally about this idea of what is the relationship between a mind and the physical world, or the world in general. And I think my take on it is something like, you have this sort of relationship that runs in one direction from the mind to the world, where you're sort of saying, hey, that the mind is making an intention and it's going out and affecting the world. And you need that in order to like, you need to affect the world in order to like get food and all these kinds of things. If you couldn't affect the world, then you couldn't sustain yourself. And then also, secondly, you need to go out and maybe perform experiments and get data back in order to like test your theories. And that more connects with your idea of like the solipsism, because it's saying like, one way to frame the idea of like what can you know about the world is the idea that you could say, I can imagine a lot of worlds. Which one are we in? That's the question. And so, I can imagine a world where things always go upward. Like if you throw a ball into the sky, it just goes up into the heavens. Or I can imagine one where it goes down to earth, or just stays where it is. These are things I can imagine. So which one of those worlds are we in? And if it was impossible for you to go out and do an experiment, then you wouldn't know which one. You could say, I'm imagining 3 worlds right now, but I just don't know which one I'm in. And so I guess you could make a slight variant to that and say, like, imagine you're on some other world and you want to discover not which world you're in, but you're on the phone with your grandma. And you want to discover which world she's in. So you'd say, like, okay, well, you're either in ball goes up world, ball stays still, or ball goes down world. So we're going to work together now to try to find out which one you're in. And so we now all recognize the logical possibility of these 3 different worlds, but now we got to do some stuff to find out which one you're in, grandma. So what if you try this, you try that? And if it was the case that she just couldn't go out and try any of them, like she's like, I'm tired. Okay, well, we're not gonna be able to figure this one out. So you can't distinguish, you can't falsify, you can't get rid of, refute any of those 3 possibilities. But if you can, go out there and do the experiment, if you can get the right photons, if you can set up the right experiments, then you can start saying like, oh, these possibilities can't be right, and these other ones, you can start carving up the space of possibilities. And so I think that's one way to frame this whole idea.
Mm-hmm. And what was the part that you disagreed with the logic machine? Like, we can't have a robot I think he's saying that we can't have a robot that's just logic. And is that where you're disagreeing?
Well, yeah. So the book is kind of explaining this long-standing debate, and sort of pushing towards one side of it. And I think really, different people have tried different things over the last, whatever it is, 50, 70 years, ever since Turing, to like see, okay, hey, let's try and make an artificial mind. Let's try this. Let's try that. And first it was more symbolically minded. Let's make programs, and let's see how, let's make them search for things. And then nowadays it's let's train neural networks on lots of data. So lots of things have been tried, and throughout this whole process, people have had their successes, but also failures, and have wondered what is it that we're missing? That's the question. And so every generation will sort of look back and say, oh, like, okay, these guys were doing X, but they're missing out on Y. I think that's what was missing. And then they try it, and nothing so far has worked. Or it depends where you're standing. Like some people are very impressed with modern LLMs, or everyone should be impressed, but you can wonder whether or not that indicates that we're hot on the heels of actually making a real mind, or we're not. Is the kind of success we're seeing in any given system the right kind of success? So this book is kind of making its own point, saying, oh, like you were thinking too symbolically. Actually, you need to be thinking more, what they call like, neurologically or whatever, but also like more connected with the world and interacting with the world. It needs to be more central. And so my sort of research direction is to sort of say like, okay, I'm going to do the same thing, where we're going to say, look at everything else that's happened and say, I don't think that's enough. And I'm going to propose my own version of what I think is missing. And my version is not from the one from the book. It's more like saying that I think that the really key thing that you need to understand for the mind is to say, there's this whole huge infinite set of possible ideas of everything that can be computed. And so that's the search space, which we are navigating, and every possible intelligence will ever navigate. And there's good stuff in there, and bad stuff. And how do you find how do you both navigate from where you are now to some of the good stuff, and recognize that it's good, and do it quickly, do it efficiently? That's the core problem. And I think I'm not entirely sure that how often or if ever that has been phrased in that way, or whether it's too obvious to state for some people. I don't know. Maybe it's obvious. Maybe it's I don't know. But that seems to me to be like the starting point.
Mhm.
And then once you're there, you can begin to ask, okay, like what does it take to find what kinds of steps can you take? What is the cost of those steps? How many steps does it require for you to get to from where you are now? Because every system starts somewhere. When you're born, you have some stuff in your head. And what does it take to go from that simple baby level starting point to, converging on how to correctly fly a 747 with 200 passengers and not kill them all? Like, that is a path which has been done routinely by human minds, but what else can do that? And anyway, so there's this question of how do you find these paths to good ideas, which are out there, and not take wrong turns along the way that either take you to bad ideas or take you on hugely circuitous and inefficient paths to good ideas. That would take you.
Mhm.
It's no good training to be a pilot if it takes you 10 billion years. So somehow we avoid that. We get it done in 10 or whatever.
So I guess you could rehabilitate his idea a little bit, just saying that sometimes the embodied, interacting with the world is more efficient for some problems. But then also sometimes the symbolic thinking is more efficient for going through the search space for some problems. But you have no particular one is not better than the other necessarily for you. You're just looking for what is the efficient way of traveling this search space.
Yeah, well, I guess so. If I try to steel man or see what's to be learned from his take, it could be that like it's just the wrong take entirely. Like if that's not the thing that was missing. Um, but I think everybody's seeing a little bit of a useful part of the picture. In this case, part of it has to do with the idea that about the symbolic versus connectionist debate about like, hey, what kinds of formats of information should we care about? That's kind of what you brought up earlier. Hey, it seems like there's some kinds of media which can do anything. But then again, there is that question that isn't necessarily obvious that any given medium can contain any type of meaning or any type of idea. So there's that question of like, can it represent that at all? And also, secondly, can it do it well in some sense, like efficiently or conveniently? So those are these questions. And in the case of symbolic versus connectionist, should I represent things as A plus B equals C, like an equation, or do I have to have it like this idea is just represented across 10,000 neurons with all these crazy connections? There's no simple formula that encodes that knowledge. So there's this debate that could be either or. Probably the truth of it is like you need both. Both of these ways of representing information can be useful. If you want to recognize a lion, it seems like putting a bunch of neurons together is the best way to recognize a lion. And if you want if you want to actually do math, it's very nice if you could just say, hey, I have this equation and I can just flip out one symbol for another or whatever. I don't have to edit 50,000 neurons. I can just say, hey, what if this was flipped? And that's useful too. So that's focusing on the information representation sort of idea, or like what kinds of information structures matter. And then on the question of your relationship with the world, there's this more question of, what is important about that? And I think, as I said earlier, it is important that you be able to interact with the world in order to like sustain yourself and improve things, build new tools. If that was not possible, that'd be a very, very serious limitation. You need to go out there and you need to test your ideas, because if you have ideas about the world, you need to figure out, okay, I can imagine many worlds. Which one are we in? Okay, you need to be able to do that. However, also, if you have a world where lions are trying to eat you and you need to find your food. Like these are all concrete problems with concrete solutions. And so they are, it is useful to be trying to solve such problems. However, the physical world is not the only source of such problems. You can be just thinking about math and trying to solve math. And so you don't need a lion in order to like force you to make some kind of progress. Yeah. So yeah, the physical world is not the only source of problems.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a kind of a long line of books like that kind of it's sort of the grand question of the era ever since the computer was invented was like, okay, if you think that mind is a computer, then how do we build one? And
Mm-hmm.
everybody has tried lots of things, and there's this continuous conversation over the decades to try to see what's missing right now, what's been tried, what was wrong with that. Let's try and see. Um, yeah, so I think there's this very simplifying and unifying picture. Once you just say, hey, there's this big space of ideas, and how do you navigate it? That is the question. And so I think the book that I'm working on now is sort of like starting with that picture, and then trying to lay out a sequence of chapters that say, okay, here's one element of that picture, in particular, like here's one thing you can do, here's one type of process that can exist, which can improve the way you navigate that space, which can, for instance, reduce the number of steps required to go from some starting point to a really good place. Like, hey, Einstein discovers relativity. That's a good point to get to. And so here's one way in which you could make that path from some starting point to relativity take fewer steps. And here's another way where you could say, not only can we do that, but maybe we can take bigger steps, or like if there's a tree of exploration, chop off some of those branches of exploration more quickly. And so again, that makes you more efficient. You're taking less steps overall. Uh, if you're thinking at a more abstract level, again, not about atoms, but about higher level concepts, that's going to help you take bigger steps. So anyway, these are that's kind of the structure I'm thinking about right now.
Mm-hmm. Do you take it that knowledge is always solving a problem, or is that too simplistic, or what? Yeah, how do you feel about that?
I guess the way that I think about it is just, again, that like there's this space of possible ideas,
Mm-hmm.
and independent of whether any of those are useful or whatever, those are all possible things. Uh, hey,
Hey, what's
Zal,
up, Z?
Guys.
we're talking right now about sort of the first chapter of my book that I'm thinking about, that I'm working on right now, where I kind of lay out the idea that the central question of AGI is that there's this huge space, this huge search space of ideas, of everything that can be computed, and the real mystery is how do you go from wherever your starting point is to reaching some great adaptation, some great idea like relativity, and how do you do that quickly.
Yeah.
And if you're low intelligence, then you can never get there, or you can only get there after 1 billion years, or you could get there and not even recognize you were there. But if you're intelligent,
Yeah.
you'll navigate to that spot quickly and efficiently and recognize its value and exploit that information. And so that's kind of the general picture here. And I don't know if Zachary, you want to repeat your question real quick?
Yeah, I'm just wondering about problems and where problems fit in here, because it seems like you're focusing on the ideas a lot, which I like, but do we consider the useful ideas as always solving a problem or not?
I guess I prefer to like kind of deconstruct things a little bit and say, okay, A, there are all these ideas. Okay, that's number one. B, some of these ideas are better than others according to certain criteria. So there's a various criteria and whatever. And some ideas are very good according to some criteria and not to others. Like, relativity is great if you want to explain physics. It's not really great if you want to like, eat a good burger. You need culinary knowledge for that. So not everything is good according to all criteria, but
Mm-hmm.
certain ideas are very good depending on which criteria you're looking at. So yeah, A, there's all these ideas. B, many of those ideas are criteria, and there are relationships among all that stuff. C, there's also a question of yeah, with the criteria, one thing that's relevant there is that if you were to find a good idea, there's a separate question of whether or not you could recognize its value, um, and exploit it where it's useful. So that's another thing about like the reach of an idea or the value of an idea is that you want to use it where it's useful and not where it's not. And so if you were to luck upon the idea of relativity, but not recognize its value, or think that it was useful for cooking burgers, and you're like, oh, something tells me this idea is great, but you don't know in which sense it's great, then you're not going to really benefit from it. So the larger picture here is I'm trying to kind of like divide things into not so much some sort of single statement like all knowledge solves a problem, but to say, okay, like there are these separate issues. What is this search space? What's in it? Uh, one of the things we care about is being able to recognize that something is good and exploit its value. What does it take to do that? Also, not only does that point exist, but you have to get your way from some simpler starting point where you don't know about that idea to creating that idea. So how does that work? And what are the better and worse ways of doing that? So I'm thinking of it in terms of these separate problems, not so much a singular rule, like all knowledge solves a problem.
But then here, let's say most, okay, so problems have some sort of inherent criteria for selecting the idea that solves the problem. Um, is that right? Does that sound right to you?
Say again?
That problems have inherent criteria for selecting the ideas that solve the problem.
Oh, I guess one way that I would put it is that, yeah, so maybe it's helpful to like back up a second and say that like, one of my initial motivations or starting points for all this research stuff was to kind of say, okay, like I think David Deutsch argues for the relevance of three things. And the first one as well, talk about most here, which is first one is the idea of like Popperian problem solving and how and its various steps. Second was the idea of universality. And then third was the idea of like explanatory knowledge versus non-explanatory knowledge. So those are all things I want to talk about in a minute. And the first one here that you've raised is more about the problem solving aspect. And the first step of that in the Popperian picture is, hey, you've got a problem. And now that tells you, hey, what ideas do you want to come up with to solve that problem? And also, which criteria do you want to use to assess your solutions? Because if you want to, save yourself from the lion, come up with some ideas for that, and you test them according to whether or not they will actually help you evade the lion. And so one of the questions I had initially was, okay, if Popper thinks that all these various things are important, having a problem, coming up with new ideas, assessing the quality of those, that's interesting. And it's also one thing that's interesting is you can ask, is every one of those steps absolutely necessary for making progress? And you're nodding your head, so that maybe we talked about this before already. And
Well, yeah, clearly, biology does not have problems that are
yeah,
noticeable that it can recognize and point towards. So, yeah, there must be able to be some progress without problems.
exactly. And so that made me think, okay, do you need these things for progress? And if not, what is their value? Like, why are they important? And so in the case of problems, to me, the idea was you can make progress if you just try a bunch of stuff and keep what works, and that's what evolution does. So you don't have to have any notion of like, oh, I'm trying to solve this or I'm trying to solve that. You don't need that to make progress. You could be a bumbling fool and make progress, and that's what evolution does. So its actual value is just to say we're going to focus the resources available on trying specific things, and not trying other things that we could have tried. I could bang sticks together this way or that way and put rocks in there and whatever. But if I have a particular focus, I'll just focus on the sticks for making the fire, and I'll leave the stones in the backyard. And likewise, I'll also say not only will I try specific things, but I will judge what I try in specific ways. And I will assemble my criteria in a very thoughtful way. I could just, in the case of evolution, like a new thing happens and then it just goes through life and all kinds of stuff happens, and something's trying to chase you, and a hot day might try to kill you. Lots of things are happening, lots of selection pressures are acting on you, and just somewhat haphazard ways. Whereas in the human case, you might say like, oh, I came up with a new idea and instantly I'm going to check, if I'm trying to make a cube, does it fit into the right cube hole that I'm trying to fit it into? Does this lock fit this key? And I just do that right now. I don't just like throw it into the universe and have lots of things happen to it, including maybe somebody tries to put this key in the lock. I just say, hey, I want this key to fit in this lock. I'm now going to test that right now. And I'm not going to do anything else. I'm not going to try to taste and see whether it tastes good. That's an irrelevant criteria. I'm just going to ask this one question of it. So you are focusing tremendously on both what you try and how you judge it. That is what is happening when you talk about problem solving. So that's the general picture. And lastly, I'll also just say that that because the value of a problem is to focus you on what you try and how you judge it, anything that helps you focus on what you try and how to judge it is useful. That is the core functionality of a problem. And so you don't have to have an explicit problem for you to somehow focus your energies in what you try and how you judge it. You could just be like, oh, I'm interested in such and such, and I don't know why. I can't describe that as like, oh, I have a specific problem, like I want X, but the situation is Y. I'm just saying something vaguely interests me, and that is guiding you towards trying things in that direction. And maybe also seeking out that feeling of excitement. You have some feeling there. You don't know what it is or how to describe it, but you're judging that like when I turn away from this direction, I don't feel that anymore. And when I turn more in that direction, I'm starting to feel that more strongly. So that's how I'm going to judge my progress. So that is the general picture and how I think of problems. It's like, oh, like the idea of an explicit conflict of ideas is not necessary. It's just a special case of this phenomenon of focusing you on trying certain things and judging them in particular ways.
Nice. Yeah, because of you, I always think of attention as the more general form of problems. Anything that focuses attention, or anything, any criteria, or any reason for changing your attention or whatever, is the more general form of problems. Hmm.
Nice. Cool. Any other questions on that point, or I had a couple of things I wanted to talk about as well.
I don't have a I have a cloud of thoughts in one direction, but it's not really a clear question. I'm wanting to know more about selection in your conception here, because it sounds like you're saying often we get to an idea, and based on some criteria, we determine that it's correct, or that it's good, or it's right, or it's useful, or whatever. You've used a lot of different language for it. And I'm imagining that's what the selection part, right? That's the selection part of the variation and selection. Um, yeah, could you give me more details, or is there more to say about selection? Is there more specific things that you can say about it?
The most important thing for me to talk about usually is number one, that you need a diversity of criteria. And that's that's one situation where universality, sort of the second topic I want to talk about, comes up, because you face decisions and in the creative process at all times, and the character of those decisions is continually changing. Like if you're a sailor, you confront a problem on one day for getting water versus something else the next day, and you get to some new island you never confronted before. Like things are changing as you're going, and the decisions are changing, and therefore the criteria that you need to make a good decision are again changing. And this is happening no matter how far you go. You're going to need new criteria to make your decisions. You can just imagine somebody who like a businessman who's like a caveman, and you try to put him in the boardroom at Google and try to make him make good decisions. You're like, he's just not going to have the right criteria. Whatever else he's got doesn't have that. So that's one thing. And so you need a brain. If you're interested in building a powerful system, a brain or some machine learning AI scientist or what have you, one of the things you're going to need to look at is what kinds of selection criteria are there in the system? Is it open-ended? Can it go on in forever? Or is there, just one particular measure that, or a small set, these 10 criteria, and that's the only thing it cares about. So that's one kind of a general issue that matters. A second thing is that when it comes to selection, there are often, it's often easy to overlook that there are actually two quite distinct things happening. One of them is judging something according to certain criteria. Such and such tastes good or tastes bad. And then secondly, doing something about it. Hey, this tastes bad. I'm going to throw it away. I'm going to give it a bad review. Or it tastes good. I'll eat more of it and recommend it. You can divorce those two things. So you can imagine a world where my favorite example is, in the case of biology, imagine that in selection, a lion catches a gazelle and just lets it go. It says, I caught you. We're done. It's just touch football. Go do your own thing. So if it doesn't eat him, then there's no selection pressure in the sense of actually doing something about this competition we've just run. I've discovered you're slow. I should eat you, but I'm just going to let you go. So now your ancestors will not be particularly fast because we haven't killed all the slow ones. And likewise, in the mind, you can ask, okay, how do you judge the quality of an idea? But then B, what happens to an idea judged as good versus one that's judged as bad? Like, how do you make good ideas? Once you can recognize that ideas are good, but how do you make them affect your mind more? And it's not enough just to say, like, I want to affect the mind more. Like, you want to. There's also the thing of, like, this idea is good for certain reasons and therefore should be used in certain cases. Which are those cases, and how do I make that happen? Like, if you have like I don't know, think of your own example, I guess, but if you have a thing that should only be used in one situation, you want to connect those two things in the brain. You want to associate them. And you want to say, like, oh, like, yeah, when I am giving a very formal meeting, I want to use this type of word and not these other more informal words I would use with friends. And so all these words could be good in some sense, but they have their place. So how do you encode that idea in the brain, that these things have their place here and not there? And maybe certain other things you just say, oh, they have no place. Like, this idea is just terrible. Although, by the way, as I say that, even very bad ideas have their place in the sense of you want to often discuss them, criticize them, explain why they're bad, so you don't delete them from the brain. Just because you don't like communism doesn't mean it shouldn't be in your brain. You want to be maybe aware of it as a danger. You want to be aware of why it's wrong and how to make sure that anybody else who has that idea, you can argue against it. So it's actually quite important that if you hate communism, that you have a very, keep your enemies closer type thing. Like, you want to keep that in your brain and know a lot about it. So as to defend against it. But anyway, the point you raised was about selection criteria. And just to reiterate, I was pointing out that, like, you often need many selection criteria in an open-ended way. So if you're trying to design a system, you want to make it often have many selection criteria or an open-ended set. And then secondly, in the case of selection, you have criteria, and you also have doing something once you've assessed the criteria.
I guess there's also the distinction of having an idea or knowing an idea and then enacting it in some way or using it, as I think you usually say using it, right?
I guess I like to say that you have an idea, and then there's like this. You ask, what is its causal power? And even if you don't actually use an idea, like, it could be the sort of thing which is like, if the situation ever arose, you would definitely use it. So it's like,
well, I'm thinking of the what you said about communism, where you have the bad idea, but you don't want to use it. You just want to have it as an explanation of where you might go wrong or how to spot the danger of that idea. So you do have it, like you have the knowledge of it, you have it in your mind, but you never want to use it. You only want to use it for talking about it or explaining it or avoiding it.
yeah, but in that case, yeah, you're very much using it still. You're just saying, I'm not going to propose legislation that is consistent with communism or whatever.
Right.
However, you could be the sort of person who's like, your entire life is devoted to fighting communism. So it's like it's a thing that's affecting your behavior the most, in some sense. So yeah. Yeah. So I guess you could say is that the key thing is sort of to think about not just like whether an idea has an effect, but like which effect is it having. That's one kind of thing. So you can think about. I often like to think of a sort of the connection between ideas and situations. And so there's you can imagine a person who, like, if you view two circles in your head, one is the circle of all your ideas, and the second is a circle of all the different situations you could be in. One of those situations, let's say, is like you're giving a speech about what you want to do for the country if you're the president, and another one is like maybe I don't know, something else, and so you're just thinking which ideas get used in which situations. And so you can ask, yeah, which situations would you involve communism? And maybe you could say, like, if you get more focused in the situation side of things, you could say, okay, yeah, this circle that represents all the situations I could be in. And if you get even more detailed, you could say, okay, the one circle there has not only the fact I'm giving a speech, but I'm in the part of the speech now where I'm talking about what I want to do, what is good. And then I have the second part of the speech, which is all the things I think are wrong. And so now, which of these two little sub situations is going to get the communism part? Is it going to be the part of my recommendations, or the things that I hate? And so you can just imagine turning that arrow one way or another. And if you're a person who suddenly begins to think, oh, communism is awful, then this is going to shift where all your arrows go. Your behavior is going to change in 10,000 different ways. There's going to be moments where people are cheering for communism and you fail to cheer that intensely, or you're a little slower to do so, or you don't do it at all, and so on. Like, many things will change. So one way to think about sort of the role of the mind is that if you look at the circle of all your ideas and all the situations where you might use them, the mind is sort of continuously shifting and configuring where all these arrows are going. As ideas become more interesting to you, you're acting more on them. As you change your views about what's true and what's not, that's again changing things. And a world where you couldn't do that would be one where, like, you really couldn't change your ideas. Anyway, that may come across as too abstract or weird or something. That's one
Oh, not at all.
mental image.
Yeah, very cool. Okay. And then, all right, I didn't know what you wanted to, did you want to go on to universality, or did you have another topic? Totally.
Well, yeah. So the initial thing I was going to say was just that as I'm working on my book, I'm kind of recalling my own kind of history with the ideas and trying to understand how best to explain them and how they differ from maybe what's out there right now, what's kind of the most mainstream discussion points. And so for me, as I looked at that, I thought, oh, yeah, the first three ideas I kind of began with after I read The Beginning of Infinity was, the three ideas I focused on most, and the three ideas which I thought most were different from the mainstream, were, on the first hand, Popperian problem solving, as opposed to learning from data. So this first pillar now is thinking about the relationship between theories and data, and like, what is kind of the core engine of progress. And if you view it as taking in data and doing stuff with it, that's one view of like what it takes to make progress. And therefore you think, oh, we need more data. That's a key thing. Or we need more computation. That's the thing. And so if you take the view that, no, actually this Popperian problem solving is the main picture of what is the engine of progress, then that's a very fundamental thing. I guess the loose way to describe it again is, what is the core engine of progress? And your answer to that question will drive everything else that you do. So, it's very important to get that right. And Popper provides a unique and unusual answer to that question. So that's one huge, arguably the most important starting point. And he's inspired by Darwin and all this stuff. So that's pillar number one. Pillar number two is the idea of universality. That's something I hadn't seen discussed so much outside of Deutsch. You really only see it in the case of one researcher named Marcus Hutter. And he has this research about induction and universal induction. And so he's got this view that, so he sort of says, I'm going to take universality seriously. I want a thing that can do anything, that is the most general possible thing. And so that's very good. The problem is that he got the first pillar, Popperian problem solving, wrong. He's starting with the inductive learning from data sort of picture. So it's important to get all of these three pillars right. And I don't think anybody else is taking all of these three pillars seriously. So he got pillar number two right and pillar number one wrong. So yeah, and so it's very interesting to take the idea of universality seriously, and anyone who does that is worth looking at, I think. And part of the reason that it's interesting is that I'm trying to kind of the way that I think about it is if you want to explain like what makes humans special or what you know even if you think humans aren't special, like just imagine like what is the ideal possible you know intelligent system. That's kind of what Marcus Hutter is doing. He's like I don't think humans are doing this, but this is the most powerful thing I can imagine. So I think that's an interesting question. And I happen to think that humans are special. So I want to say, like, why is it that we're doing all this stuff? And like the next best system is not doing anything close to that. It's not like squirrels are making some progress and we're just a little faster. It's just like we're doing this thing, and it seems like nothing else is even trying to do this stuff. It's like not like the squirrels have a failed moon program. And so that's this question. It seems like there's a huge gap to be explained. So whatever the differences in intelligence that we're considering, it seems like there has to be like a really big leap. Like it should be very obvious in retrospect. Like it shouldn't be like a dubious small thing. It should be like there's this Grand Canyon thing that is just in front of us. And once you learn how to see it, it should just be very obvious. Like, oh shit, there is a Grand Canyon between us and the squirrels. So what is the Grand Canyon? That is the question. And so this idea of universality seems like a very promising candidate because it's the difference between something which can do a finite set of things or a subset of what's possible and a system which can do anything. And one more thing to say about that is that the existence proof of this in a slightly different situation is that universal computers can compute anything, and we have this sequence of weaker computing systems. The Chomsky hierarchy, and there's various ways of describing it, I guess. But we have a very weak computing system that can only do certain things. And then there's like 3 or 4 levels to this, which are increasingly powerful with the universal system at the top and nothing above it. And so that's the Turing completeness. So you look at that and you think, I wonder if intelligence works the same way as that hierarchy. It seems like it's possible, it's conceivable, it's plausible that you have this really sharp distinction. Which seems to match on to the difference between squirrels and everything else and humans on the other side of that, on the universal side. So that's pillar number 2. We can pause there for a second just so I don't say everything at once and try to tax your memory too much.
No, I mean I'm following. I like it, and yeah, we can keep going.
Cool. And then just the last pillar there is the idea of explanatory knowledge. And so again, this is, I think, something that Deutsch focuses on again that is somewhat special. But by the way, just to backtrack for 1 second, I said that each of these ideas is interesting. It's sort of highlighted in David Deutsch's work, and it's different from the mainstream. And so just to explain that last bit, why the pillar 2 is different from the mainstream, universality is not that common. The alternative that is usually thought about is just a sort of continuous graph or continuous ordering of all intelligent systems. So where you can just be a little more efficient, you can be a little more intelligent, and there's sort of this infinite scale. And we can imagine humans at one point on that scale, and super intelligence that is somewhat better, and maybe a super intelligence that's better than that, and just different levels. And this idea of universality sort of says not only is there not just a continuous thing, there's these leaps in capability where like they're just huge differences, but also there's a maximum. There's just once you can do everything, it's not like everything plus 1. Like just it's just so you can do everything, and then that's all there is. And so in that view, there are categorical differences in intelligence and a maximum. And I think both of those are sort of not the mainstream. The mainstream is there are continuous differences, not discrete differences, and there is no maximum. You can be more and more efficient and intelligent. And so if you take universality seriously, then both of those mainstream views are wrong. It's not continuous, and you can't go on forever. And therefore, really what matters is A, your intelligence, and then B, your knowledge. And your knowledge can go on growing forever. That part is true. So the mainstream view sort of confuses intelligence and knowledge. And so that's the mainstream versus Deutschian, Popperian, my picture on that point.
Do you see any difference with So like, could we have a system that can create infinite novelty? Like it's universal in terms of the novelty that it can create, but not universal in terms of how it selects. And then perhaps another system that is limited in the novelty that it can create, but it's it has universal selection.
Oh yeah, yeah. So if you think about universality, one of the points that comes up is there only one form that matters or several? And as you said, like is it possible to have if variation and selection both matter, can you have universality for one and not the other? Um,
Right.
and so that's definitely true. And you can make a system which only has one set of criteria and only one way of judging things, and yet can produce anything. And it's very trivial to do that in the sense of like, for instance, um, like you any computer program which starts off with some things and starts combining them in various ways um, can begin exploring a huge space. And if you just have the program keep on combining things, you don't even have to have any criteria at all. And just say, I start off with all the letters of the alphabet. I'm going to begin combining them in all possible ways. And so after a few steps, I'll have produced all possible three-letter combinations of all the letters, or all 30-letter combinations. And you can keep on going as long as you want. And then you could say, oh, I want to have a way of judging those, and I'll build that in, whatever. So you can have a system which can explore, and then the separate set of criteria. And you could imagine the reverse case where it's like, oh, I have the letter A, and that's all. That's the whole search space. There's no way of combining anything or trying anything new. It's just letter A, and then I have this rich set of all possible. And you assemble a team of experts, thousands of experts to judge the letter A, and then they have nothing much to judge. You have the best chef in the world and the best engineer, and Elon Musk has been hired for an hour to assess the systems, and you just give him all the letter A. Okay, well, very rich set of criteria, very poor exploratory space.
Hmm. Hmm. And are there other things like that? Like, sorry, not are there other things, but would you consider that to be, mm, mm. Are those, you said there are different types of universality. Yes. Are they different orders of intelligence, maybe? Or what is the name for the distinction with a system that has, is open-ended in all the forms of attention, variation, selection, and so on, and then the system that is limited with attention but still has unlimited universal variation and selection, or open-ended attention but limited variation and open-ended selection, whatever it is. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know that they all have names or that the names are necessarily important, but I do think what's important is to say like, oh, like once you have an idea of what are the important elements of a system, I like to call all these different intelligent type of systems to be like epistemological systems or something, or whatever you want to call them, intelligent systems. And one of the things I like to focus on is what I like to call like the elements of knowledge creation. Knowledge, variation, selection, attention, also physical transformations. These are all things which you kind of need in your picture if you want to understand like what a robot is doing, what an animal or a human are doing, what evolution itself is doing. If you take away any one of these little things, if you take away the idea of knowledge, for instance, you're not going to notice that genes are important or the things that are in the brain are important. And you need to recognize that. And so you need to see that these are the important things, and you need to know how to judge versions of those things. So as you may have knowledge in your system, but do you have only a finite amount of it, like a small amount, or can you extend it? That's an important question. If you have a case of a system which can produce novelty, you could say, how much novelty? Does it run out? Does it keep on going forever? Does it have not only can it do an infinite number of things, but can it do everything that is possible? So there are certain things which matter in intelligent systems. And for each one of those things that matter, there are better and worse versions of it. And so you want to be able to recognize what matters and the better and worse versions of it and see, also why that matters. And then if you want to give each of them a name, you can, because some of these will be things that you see in reality. Like, for instance, if we take this way of analyzing things and look at the case of like a thermostat, you'd say, oh, like this is trying things. What it has is it has a certain set of things it can do. It can raise the temperature or lower it. And it has a certain way of assessing the situation. Like, is this matching the temperature I want that has been set by the customer or whatever? uh, and then act accordingly. So, but it has a very small set of things it can do. Like it's not going to talk to you. These days, who knows? But the old types won't, and and it's also not going to judge anything except based on temperature. You could imagine a thermostat which like judges your mood, and it's trying to optimize the temperature for your mood or something. All kinds of possibilities. But in this case, we know what to look for. Look for its what kinds of what is its search space, so to speak, and then what is the set of criteria that it's using to judge what it tries, or to judge the situation. And then you could also ask, like maybe like once you have assessed the situation, what do you do about it? So you're asking like, what is the causal relationship involved? Because you could imagine a thermostat which measures the temperature, knows what to do, and then never does it. And just the causation isn't there. So that's an example of saying like there may not be a name for that category, but we're looking at the right things, and we can begin exploring them and relating to those to other systems and saying, oh, what if we can imagine alternative thermostats now, and all that stuff. We can piece together one point in this broad space of possible intelligent systems.
Okay. And then explanatory knowledge is the last pillar.
Yeah. And so this one is interesting, and what I guess it's interesting because of the distinction between explanatory and non-explanatory knowledge, and the idea that in genes you're seeing knowledge, but it's not. There's something missing there. There's something more that it could be doing, and I kind of like to say that knowledge has two roles, two things it can do, and this sort of relates a little bit to this distinction. Number one, it can make certain things happen. And that's what genes do. You have those genes that make certain proteins happen, that makes your body develop a certain way and makes you better adapted to your environment. So the genes may not represent anything like specific. They may not like encode the idea that the sky is blue, but they will make your eyes work in such a way that they work well in a blue sky. And that's something we mentioned before about the idea of like, is all information representing the world? Is it encoding the actual environment that the animal is in? Or is it just telling the animal how to survive? And, it happens to be surviving in a particular environment. And so you can learn about the environment if you can assess this animal and what it's doing, and understand, what it takes, in what environments would that be a good thing just for it to have blue eyes or whatever. But the genes themselves are just saying, do this. They're all instructions, just saying do that. However, there's a second thing that knowledge can do, which is capture patterns in reality, I like to say. And so, if you say the sky is blue, this is saying, hey, there's a thing in the world and it has this property. Like no gene does that, as far as I'm aware. It's not saying do anything. The sky is blue, therefore go and look at it or avoid it. It doesn't say to do anything. And it can be true or false. And once you have this idea of true or false, or matching reality or not, or just the idea of reality, it becomes very interesting. Because if you say, hey, there is only one reality, therefore anything that I say about it has to sort of match. Well, this is a very interesting and kind of new type of knowledge. It's encoded in bits, just like the old stuff, just like genes. However, it sort of relates to the idea of like there being new kinds of criteria, and there's something different and new and interesting and potentially very, very useful about this second thing that knowledge can do. And just to say, for example, like if again, earlier I said that, hey, the first pillar is Popperian problem solving, and it's sort of the engine of progress. And one of the types of things you can ask about the engine of progress is sort of like, where do you get your signal from about like where to, what is the good way to improve your ideas? You need a progress signal. You need an error signal, a feedback. You need that from somewhere. Even people who are very interested in sort of an empiricist learning from data sort of picture will say, we need an error signal from somewhere. We think it comes from data or from gameplay, in the case of AlphaGo or something. We need some error signal. Otherwise, we don't know how to improve the system. So one question you can ask is, where does that error signal come from? And what explanatory knowledge gives you is sort of a new error signal. It says instead of looking for more data or anything else, you can actually just turn inward and say, do all of my ideas match each other? Because if you say that the sky is blue and you say the sky is red, never mind. We can stop looking at the sky for a moment and just say both of these ideas can't be true. Because I think that the world is only one way. So I have to say either the sky is blue sometimes and the sky is red sometimes. I have to weaken the statements, or I have to somehow start massaging these two ideas so they fit. And again, as I'm making them fit, I'm not gathering any new data. I'm not testing any new ideas. I'm just trying to make them fit. I'm trying to make them coherent. I'm trying to make them consistent. And so this is a new error signal. And it's one that I think you don't quite get from the non-explanatory knowledge, which just says, do this. If I say, do this and do that, I guess there is a conflict there if I'm telling you to do both at the same time. But if I'm not, if sometimes I say do this and sometimes I say do that, that's perfectly fine. And I can have an infinite variety of things that I tell you to do in different situations. However, if I say like, basically, if anywhere in the system says the sky is always blue, and anywhere else in the system it says the sky is always red, it doesn't matter which one of these I'm talking about at a given moment. Like if they're both in your brain, there's a problem. There's a signal that is available there if you recognize that these ideas shouldn't both be in your head at the same time. Then you can do something about it. So that's one element of the specialness of explanatory knowledge. Suddenly you have said all your ideas need to match. You weren't saying that before in the case of genes, etc. Now you're imposing a brand new set of constraints. And by the way, there's a huge number of constraints there, because if you have 100 ideas in your head, they all have to match. Now potentially you're saying idea A has to match with B and C and D and E. Okay. And when you go to idea B now, it has to match with A and C and D and E. So you have this sort of, if you have 100 ideas, you have like potentially like 100 squared. It's a large number, a set of constraints. And if you have 1 million ideas, way more constraints. So suddenly this thing is not only just a new source of, we call it like an error signal, but it's actually like a tremendously huge one, maybe bigger than all the data you could ever collect. Just the idea of trying to make your ideas match is like a huge puzzle to solve. And so, and therefore, when somebody comes and says, "Hey, I just met my grandma on Alpha Centauri," you go, "Wait." Or if they said, "Hey, I met my great 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 grandma on Alpha Centauri for a Zoom call," you'd say, "Well, I don't think you can talk on Zoom to someone at that distance. I don't think there's ever been a human that has been that old, that's been alive." So this one sentence is triggering your existing knowledge in 2 or 3 different ways. And so you know there's an error there. Despite the fact that you haven't collected tons of data, you can now begin to engage in that process of trying to make things coherent, despite having only heard one sentence. And you don't have to go do any more experiments in the meantime. So there's probably more to be said about the power of explanatory knowledge and all that kind of thing. But already, just with that one thing, there's something big happening here at the very least. So those are the 3 pillars. And so again, to maybe reiterate the difference between that view and the conventional or mainstream view, that it says, we just have a bunch of stuff in a neural network. That view says, it looks at knowledge and says, hey, we want to have a big model. We want to have it arranged nicely. We want to have a good architecture, but it doesn't necessarily focus that much on consistency. It doesn't say there is one world and it has to work, and all ideas about it need to sort of fit. And we're going to try to, and because, ideas will never fit together perfectly. The mind's real role is just to try to improve the ideas in certain directions. And there are, like, incidentally, there are neural network models that are trying to be world models, but I'm not quite sure if they are explanatory in the sense that matters here, which is more like you want to engage in the never-ending process of making your ideas about the world match each other and match the world. That process is the important thing. The important thing is not just that you have a model of the world, but that you are engaged in that sort of ongoing process of making it, again, match your ideas about the world, match each other, and match the world. And that process will never stop. But cool, I'll leave it there for now.
There's something I asked about LLMs. I feel like I've asked you a couple times maybe, but it doesn't even seem right to say that an LLM has an idea because they are generated after you ask a question, for example. You have to prompt it to have it output in a particular idea. So then the notion of them having multiple ideas that don't conflict, it doesn't even, to me, it doesn't seem like it makes sense. Maybe it does. Maybe somebody who's an LLM engineer understands that a little bit more. But to me, it seems like that it doesn't really add up to say that they have ideas which are all consistent. Um, so yeah, it doesn't seem to fit with this explanatory knowledge framework that you have.
Yeah, and so you can say that, yeah, before you have, yeah, the idea of explanatory knowledge is sort of that you're making claims about what the world is like, and they have
Mhm.
to fit if there is only one world.
Right.
And if you don't make any claims about the world, then you can just stack up lots of little instructions about what to do, and that's fine. And so that's what happens in the case of a genome or in a neural network. You're just saying like, I'm going to shovel the information in this way, and that's going to be useful. And you have lots of little pieces of information in the system that are useful. They achieve the desired result, and you leave it at that. But it could be that there is no statements about the world in the model. It's a little bit trickier in the case of an LLM. If people will say like you can actually go in and edit nowadays an LLM and say like change its notion of the capital of France from Paris to Dallas. Like
Mhm.
that's apparently an operation that can be done.
Hmm.
In which case you might say, well, okay, it seems like it does have a world model in some sense. Um, and maybe that leads to further questions about like, okay, well, does it really have a world model? What kinds of features do we care about in a world model? It could be the case that you'd say LMs contain lots of factual knowledge, or things which at least look superficially like factual and explanatory knowledge, and maybe the question there would be, or the issue would be, not does it contain these things, but really it's not enough to contain them. A book contains these things as well. That's not really the issue. The issue is more of like, are you engaged in the process of finding the inconsistencies and trying to resolve them? Because a neural network, which gives you, let's say, like, it could be the case that, for instance, that like, what if people in Texas think that the capital of Paris, or like there is a Paris, Texas. I'm trying to think of how to set up this thing to be most funny, but uh, okay, how about this? Uh, if you say where is Paris, everyone will say it's in France. But if you ask a Texan, they might say it's in Texas because there is a Paris,
Right.
Texas.
Mhm.
So uh, so now you can imagine a world where you're training a neural network, and one of the things it does is it figures out, is the person asking me this question in Texas or in the rest of the world? And I'll give a different answer in each case. So it would have two notions of where Paris is, and it would, give you the wrong answer potentially, depending where you're from. Uh, so that's a world where maybe there's this conflict, but there's no process kind of identifying the conflict and realizing like, oh, there are two Parises. All I've learned to do is sort of give the right answer, depending on who's asking me. But I haven't found like the real answer, the real truth, the idea that there is only one Paris, France, and there's one Paris, Texas, and they're different places. Um, so a human would maybe realize this is a problem and understand the more fundamental truth there, but the neural network may never. Um, it's not engaged in that process of trying to make its worldview consistent, despite the
Mhm.
fact it has statements like Paris is in France, Paris is in Texas.
Right. But I'm still kind of, there's a part of it that just, it doesn't seem to sit right with me. Maybe I'm just not, maybe I'm missing something here, but I feel like the LLMs, they have different parameters. So you can turn up the parameter. You can change the seed, for example. If you ask a question and you set the seed to 1, it's going to answer in the same way, a particular way. If you set the seed to 2, it's going to answer in a different way. If you set the seed to 3, it answers in another way. And you can set the seed to any integer. And that gives you many different types of answers. So you might ask it, what is the capital of France? And then set the seed differently. And some of them give you, I mean, I'm sure most of them will give you the right answer, but some of them will give you a different answer. And then you can also change the randomness, it's called the temperature for most models. You can have it be lower or higher. and that's another thing that changes how it answers. And so to me, the sense the fact that you can change all of those parameters, it kind of it kind of muddies the idea that it has ideas, because I guess the way that I'm thinking about it, and maybe I'm even thinking about this wrong for humans, for people, it seems like we have like a file that is an idea and it can contradict with another file that's an idea. Well, you open up one file and it says the sky's blue, you open up another file, it says the sky's red, and those contradict logically. And there you go. You've got two files. But in this other way of thinking about it with a LLM, there's no files that store what the capital of France is. It's just a response to some questions given some temperature, given some seeds.
Well, there's a question about how you represent all the information,
Hmm.
and that's an open question. Uh, one of the classical debates has been, is information stored in a centralized or localized way, or is it distributed? And is your notion that Paris is in France something which is actually represented across 10,000 neurons in your head? It's like this very diffuse pattern, which you can't learn from any one neuron. Or is it, more like, hey, there's just one sentence stored in, unit number 150 of the brain memory.
Hmm.
Um, but that ultimately doesn't matter, because what matters is the meaning, not the exact representation of it on your hard drive. It's like saying like Windows does it one way, what Mac does it another. But all you care is that it's right for your purposes in the end of the day. So so that question doesn't matter so much. Maybe one way to frame all this is that, as I'm thinking about it now, explanatory knowledge may not be the thing that matters, or just a statement like Paris is in France. The existence of that in the system may not be what matters. What matters is more like the ongoing process of explanation, um, the sort of explanatory thinking, you might say. And to be more precise about that, you could say what actually matters is the idea of having explanatory, uh, or if you back up, you'd say, okay, what really matters is making new ideas and judging them and assessing them. And so how can explanatory knowledge help those processes? How can I have an explanatory version of those two things? And one would be that, like, imagine that you have statements of the form, yeah, Paris is in France. So those are concepts in our heads. But what if that wasn't how the computer operated? It just operated on letters. It had no notion of Paris. It only had a notion of Paris. Uh, so you'd say, well, hey, you're not really using the right object, which is a city. You should be thinking of cities, not letters. But if it couldn't think in those terms, you'd say, well, okay, it's not really it's not capturing patterns in reality in the right way. It has no means of operating on cities, only on letters. Um, Likewise, so that's one way of saying it's not able to create new ideas and combine them and so on at the right level of abstraction. And secondly, you might also say, like, you're not analyzing with the right criteria. So what's an explanatory set of criteria? Well, in the case of, earlier, I was saying like matching. Uh, so you need your ideas to be coherent with each other. They should not conflict logically. That's a constraint you're adding to the system. So you're saying Paris is in France, Paris is in Texas. Now the question is, do you think that's a problem? Is there any way of discovering that's a problem or not? Because you can imagine a system which could be either way. Um, and so both the statements can be written in a book and not recognized as problematic. So something else has to happen for you to recognize that these things conflict. So that sort of this combination of all these things I'm talking about now. Okay, you can operate on objects which are abstract objects, cities, not just letters, and you're getting the idea of a city, and you're able to think at that level, combine that concept with other concepts that are high level. You're really now operating on these higher level patterns that match reality. That's what you want. And you want to be able to say, okay, if you're thinking explanatorily, you're not just having certain kinds of statements in your head, but you're noticing conflicts, you're worried about them, you want to resolve the conflicts. Okay. So that larger constellation of operating on patterns in reality and trying to make everything fit together and match reality as well. And that's the thing that matters. So explanatory knowledge, I say that as one phrase, but really it's a constellation of a few different activities that all have to be happening. And you can, as you said earlier, like, you could have universality in one, or in conjecture and not in criticism, or you could have explanatory thinking and conjecture, not in criticism. Um,
Mm.
there are these really core important activities and different ways of doing both of them, and universality and explanatory type thinking can be had a la carte, and you can imagine a system which is good or bad in all these ways.
Mhm. And so, okay, yeah, just to summarize the bit about explanatory knowledge, it gives us the power of matching reality, so it's either true or false, and it gives us the power of cohering with other knowledge that we have. And those are kind of the two main things, but there's perhaps more that you get from having explanatory knowledge. Am I picking that up correctly?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think a helpful way to think about it again is to just kind of always go back to the really most important level of analysis, which is that first pillar of Popperian problem solving, and saying, okay, well, and really you could even go deeper to the Darwinian thing of just there's novelty generation, and there's assessing ideas. Um, and you can ask for any given thing that seems important for intelligence, whether that's explanatory knowledge or universality. You can say, okay, well, that sounds interesting. Now, the bottom line is, does it help me with the novelty generation and the filtering and the assessment of the ideas? If it doesn't, then I don't care about it. But if you're saying it matters, then it matters in one or both of these things. That is the only reason. That's the only type of mattering I care about here. Does it somehow give me more power in terms of what idea I might try next? And again, the idea of explanatory knowledge is sort of saying, one of the things there is, are you able to think about patterns in reality, such as cities? If you get the concept of a city, then you can imagine a city and various things about it. A city moving, a city, people moving to it or away from it, a city growing, becoming smaller, being destroyed, changing its industry. Or in the sentence, there's a city. What if there was a different city there? So these are all patterns in reality, and you can be exploiting them or not. And so this is a way in which I'm saying, hey, explanatory knowledge matters, and I'll show you the bottom line because it matters in how you come up with new ideas.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I have just a question about explanatory knowledge. Do you have a definition of explanatory knowledge? Because it's kind of confusing to me that the sky is blue, that just the singular statement of the existence of the sky being blue. That does not seem to me an explanation. And maybe you're using the word more generally than I expect, but yeah, what's going on there?
I think that in everyday language, when we kind of talk about explanation, often we're talking about like resolving some problem that you have about your view of the world, and so you're like, oh, how did you jump so high? Like, well, what happened there? I thought a human could only jump 3 feet, but you jumped 20. I go like, oh, it's on a trampoline. A trampoline does this and whatever. So I'm sort of taking your initial image of the world and some problem with it, and I'm getting you to a state where everything's sort of I'm changing your view of the world. I'm editing one part of it so that now it all fits together again. So that tends to be what we talk about in the colloquial version of explanation. I'm explaining there's an explanatory problem, and I'm resolving it. That's one thing. But in terms of like this more general view of things, that's one thing that can happen. But in this more general picture, I'm kind of focusing on this more abstract, a little bit less restrictive thing, which is just like statements about how the world is. And I like to just say patterns in reality. The sky is blue, or there's a pen on the table, or universal, or gravitation works this way everywhere in the universe. These are all patterns. Some of them are bigger than others, but they're all patterns in reality. And if you can talk about them, then that can be useful. And so, and again, this goes back to that distinction I raised earlier about knowledge. Kind of, I like to say, has two jobs. One of them is to make certain things happen. The second is to capture patterns in reality. And some systems can only do one. They can only make certain things happen. They're just instructions. They don't talk about the world and how it is. But it's possible to talk about the world and how it is. And I think the problem of understanding explanatory knowledge is to sort of say, what is the cash value Well, why is it important? How is it at all helpful to talk about how the world is? Because genes and all their glory, have never done that. Um, minds, to the extent that they develop minds that can, see predators and kind of think about the world in that way, there's explanatory knowledge of a kind there. There's a nut buried at this location and that location or whatever. But the genes themselves are just saying what to do. So if they can get as far as they have, then why would you need anything else? That's one way of trying to frame it in a sort of critical way. And the answer is, hey, like as evidenced by human progress and the building of rockets, etc. There's a huge cash value and efficiency gain to be had from just saying like, oh, like this is how the world works, and I can recognize that there are these higher level objects, and so therefore I can avoid thinking about all the lower level ones, which are much more numerous and hard to think about. I can skip the atoms and go for the cities and the birds and the countries and so on. So there's explain the cash value of thinking about the world and how its patterns are. That's the value of explanatory knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Nice. And I presume that there are no patterns that cannot be captured via explanatory knowledge. Is that correct?
Oh, there are secondary questions above my pay grade about how the world actually works, independent of, I think just about how the mind works, and the idea that it's, my statements are all about like, hey, it's useful to think about how the world works. But there's a separate question about how it actually works. And that's a physicist's job. And there, Deutsch has this idea that, for instance, I don't know if this is part of the Church Turing Deutsch thesis, but that one constraint you might have on the world is that it should be explainable. Yeah. And one of the, for instance, constraints that imposes on the world is that imagine the universe, but then imagine a universe where there was actually two copies of the universe that were identical and just split up somewhere, and they could never interact at all. But it just happens to be the case that there are two exact copies of the universe playing at the same time. But because there's no way for them to interact or whatever, then there's no way to distinguish between the world where there's only one copy versus two versus three versus however many. So if you think that the world should be explicable and that you should be able to distinguish between how the world is from how it's not, then that tells you, well, we're not going to consider worlds where there's just two copies and there's no way to tell that there are two copies. We're going to rule that out and just say, well, if the world is explicable, then the world ain't like that. Mm-hmm. And that's interesting. That's actually a very concrete constraint. Then, like, it says, like, there's no magical boxes that can never be opened. There's no worlds out there that are can never be accessed or learned about. It could be the things you can't access, but they do affect the world. Like the quantum multiverse is that way, where it's like, I can't talk to my multiversal counterpart, but I can know for various reasons there is one. But that's more of a principle of physics than it is sort of about how the mind works.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Anything else? Or this is kind of my attempt to look at my own little history of the ideas and see where they, again, distinguish from or different from the mainstream. And there's sort of the starting point for the book and showing that this is kind of the ideas to take seriously and why they seem important and useful, and potentially why they, again, show you like what intelligence is really about and what the things you should care about are and how you measure intelligence and how to increase it and whether there's a maximum, and kind of pointing out, I think, these big debates. And then the rest of the book is sort of working through taking these things seriously. If you take them seriously, then what's the next step? Going into the details for each of these.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I wonder. Well, I was going to ask about if there's somebody who has, not necessarily naming any particular person, but who has the third pillar, so they understand explanatory knowledge, but they don't understand Popperian epistemology, and they don't understand universality. But I think that's a lot of people. I think it's just like that's pretty typical. Most
I
people
can
would
give you a
have.
more concrete case, which is that you can imagine building in sort of explanatory knowledge into a system, but maybe not. Maybe you're not fully engaged in the process of discovering conflicts and stuff like that. But maybe you are, for instance, operating on the idea of like cubes and spheres and the physical objects that are simple. You're building that into the system at the start, and these are abstract things. So you're sort of taking an abstract view of how the world works and what objects it contains, and then you're operating on those higher level things, like not just letters, for instance, or tokens. And so you're building in explanatory knowledge, and and as a result of that, by the way, you may have made a system which can't make new objects or can't make smaller objects than a cube. Like you've just said, hey, this cube is a primitive. There's no way of referring to atoms or things which could be parts of that cube. And so you are lacking a certain kind of universality then. Like you're not able to change everything. You're not able to consider all the possibilities. You're just saying, hey, I'm going to build in a certain view of what the world is like. But by the way, now you can't change it. So as long as my ideas map onto the reality, you're good. But if there's any point at which I'm either not capturing everything that matters or it's somehow wrong, well, the system can't handle that anymore. And so that would show again that case could be very useful. It could be great to build a system that's like that, but that's not the human mind, and that isn't a very powerful mind.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you have a way of like what type of thing would show that you're wrong? Let's just say generally about any of the pillars. I don't really have a particular one that I want to pick one, but like, what are the types of things that would like show that you're kind of in the wrong direction and you need to re-steer?
Interesting question. As I think about it, I'll just say that in the case of Newton, he would have a hard time guessing what Einstein's critique would be. So
yes,
sometimes people like to say that if you're going to propose something, you should say what would tell you were wrong, but he wouldn't have known what his actual error was. Not that I'm Newton, but but maybe no, but when it comes to the first pillar, it's kind of just distinguishing between. I kind of like to boil these things down to what seems obvious to me. Like, I think the distinctions aren't terribly complicated. If you say, hey, like I'm just talking about the idea that novelty is important, generating new things, and assessing which ones are good, and then doing something about it. I think I'm breaking these things down to the level of commonsensical things. So it's hard to. I've tried to get away from things that's too complicated and 10 steps of logical reasoning. I'd say, well, if you can't make anything new, then you're stuck with what you got, and you can never make anything better than that. So what would show me I'm wrong is if somebody can say, hey, there's a way in which your very commonsensical argument is wrong. There's only 2 or 3 steps in there. I don't see how they could be wrong. But
yes, but I think like it's fairly common. Maybe it's not, but I think it is fairly common for people to think that we don't create any new knowledge. We only, rearrange things that we already have, or we get all of our knowledge from maybe some supernatural origin, but we can't create anything new. That doesn't even create anything new. It just has all the knowledge, and we get some of it occasionally. So I can think of a few cases where somebody doesn't accept this sort of, you have to create something new. And then, the testing it, if it's doing something about it and selecting it. So anyway, I guess the question is, your view is so obvious. It seems obvious to you. It also seems obvious to me. But why hasn't that picked up? Why isn't it, why doesn't it immediately catch fire if it's so obvious?
Yeah, interesting question. I'm not sure I have the answer. One thing is that it's sort of like what is it? It's like not what you don't know, it's what you think that ain't so kind of thing. Like if it seems like the learning from data works, then fair enough. And if it seems like you can just alter the details, the mechanical details of how a machine learning system works and make progress, then these are things that seem like they're cool. They seem unproblematic. And they seem obvious in their own way. And there's a truth to that. Like, there is a value to getting more data and making it better. And so data seems like it's a big part of how neural networks work, and fair enough. So there's actually this separate question of explaining, like, okay, you're right to think about data, you're right to exploit it, but also there's this other picture you may be missing about, for instance, the relevance of the consistency among your ideas. That's something which you're not thinking about, but which is relevant. And in fact, I can show you something which your system can never do, which we can do easily, which is, say, hey, here's a couple of simple statements, make them fit together and whatever. And there's no gigabytes of data involved. How can you reproduce that? So that's part of the picture there. Also, I was going to say, yeah. And I think there's this very commonsensical idea of learning from data, and it's hard to imagine, if I just shut off all your senses, how you would make progress. And I think the mathematical type of thing is the obvious counterpoint to that. Although again, people will usually say, well, you're saying that, but you've also existed in the world with all these senses, and so if I just shut them off, on year 30 of your life, you still had all the other preceding years still to learn from data. So those are areas where you have to kind of get into the weeds and kind of explain, like, okay, I know it seems this way, but actually it works this other way. By the way, I think that as stated, my ideas would probably, the idea that you need to create novelty from somewhere, I think nobody's going to argue with that. It's just that may not be there where their mind first goes when thinking about intelligence. They're thinking about specific models and how to train them. They may not be thinking about this wider picture. So that it's more like not that they're wrong, but it focused on a special case. And you could maybe be forgiven for thinking that neural networks are the end game. But I mean, even then, a lot of people think that they aren't. They're saying we want to have other things. We know we need something else because babies can do things that our models can't do. So we know there's something else to be gained. What is it? Is it symbolic thinking? Is it this? Is it that? So for me, I think it's people are already kind of, I think, ready for seeing this picture. People are looking around, and people have always been looking around because everything keeps not working in some sense. It doesn't work at all, or it doesn't work for this, or it can't recognize images, or it can do all these great things, but it can't learn as quickly as a toddler. So what gives? People are always seeing the gaps and looking for something to fill them. And so I think this is a way of kind of stepping back and saying, instead of looking for particular gaps or ways to improve one system or another, as a grad student might do in machine learning today, just change one algorithm, is to just step back and say, what is the grand picture? What is the full picture? It is this full set of ideas, this infinite space of computable programs and ideas, and there are ways of navigating that space, and we got to think about that. So I think this is a way of zooming out and saying, again, don't try to improve one particular system, but look at the nature of the most general form of the problem. That's where this universality picture comes into play and is so useful. And that's why it's interesting to look at what I mentioned earlier, this AI-XI inductivist approach to intelligence, because whatever its other flaws, it gets the first pillar wrong about learning from data versus learning from Popperian problem solving. However, it does try to go to the end game. It says, let's just skip to the end here. Let's not try to improve one system. What is the maximal thing? What is the best thing that could exist? In their case, they incidentally talk about what is the best thing that is conceivable, but it actually can't exist. That's the problem with their setup, is that they're imagining a situation that would be ideal and optimal, but it requires like infinite amounts of computation. So no system can do that. So really what matters is not the optimal conceivable thing you can do, but the optimal thing that could actually exist. That's the real mystery. And that's where you need to talk about efficiency and all these things. And I think that's where all the interesting stuff is, by the way, too. So I don't think it's that interesting in the end to look at something that could never exist and just say, well, what if you could do it all instantly? Well, yeah, but like you can't do that. And so therefore, whatever interesting things we're doing to avoid the need for infinite computation, using a very small amount of resources to somehow achieve great things, what are the tricks for that? And then, they would say, I don't know. But that's where all the cool stuff is. So that's where the research should go.
Nice. Okay. Very cool. Yeah. I feel like I got like a full rundown of everything. But did you say this was just your first chapter? Like,
Well, yeah, we'll see where it goes. I mean, I think that may be the first chapter, because what I've done so far, I think, is trying to explain everything that I think matters.
yep.
But then in every one of those cases, there's details, and there's, okay, well, you said that explanatory knowledge matters, but that's all I've really done. But how do you? What are the specific things about it that matter? And I kind of hinted at the idea that, well, at the very least, you have to consider the variation and selection sides. So there's two sides to that coin at the very least. But there could be other things. And so you need to split those apart, look at them individually. And then, once you've done that for everything, so if there's 10 things that matter up front, and each has like 3 subcases that are important, and then so you got 30 things there, and then you want to explain, okay, well, now that you know what matters and in detail, now how do you actually achieve that? Like, how do you make a machine that does that thing? And then, by the way, how do you stick all these things together? Not only can it do A, B, and C, but it can do them simultaneously. So I think, and that's where I know less about the answer, by the way. But anyway, yeah. So that is, I think, the first chapter, and all the things that must follow.
So it's like a overview, kind of an abstract of all the things to come, and then each concept is kind of broken out into multiple chapters. Is that kind of
Who knows? I haven't actually written those things out, but I'm just thinking about
okay?
structure right now. And I have
Hmm.
my various notes I've developed over years, and I'm trying to sharpen them up. But yeah, I think what I'm trying to do right now at the moment is say, in the first chapter, I want to lay out the picture of what I think. This is the problem. These are the things you should be asking. These are the problems that matter. And already that is taking a huge right turn from the mainstream, and saying,
Right.
okay, each of these 3 areas that I mentioned of universality and problem solving and explanatory knowledge is taking a right turn, but in a way that feels familiar and right, I think, right once you see that and you go, okay, they're generalizing from what I have already seen. I realize, like, oh, if I'm focused on machine learning only, there's actually this much larger thing to consider. You don't have to just think about LLMs and variants of them. You can think, okay, let's set aside. You can put all the LLMs in a cabinet for a minute, and the human brains and everything else, and just say, what is the biggest version of the problem, and what does it take to sort of, as I like to say, just tame, if infinity, the set of all possible ideas. A
Mhm.
system which can somehow ride that crazy bull and not get lost in infinity is a good system, and that seems to be what we're doing. But that is the most general form of the problem.
Very exciting. Cool.
But cool. Is there anything else, or shall we wrap it up there?
Let's wrap it up.
Sweet. Well, thanks as always for chatting.
Yeah, I appreciate it, man. I love being here. So thanks for
Cool.
going over everything.
Adios.
See ya.
Till next time.